Hello, everyone. We are back for today's live, and Willow is coming to join me. And today I am being joined by my friend Lex. And so we're just gonna wait for. Aha! I see them. So Lex is going to be joining us shortly once Instagram decides to, oh my God, behave. And Willow's going to crawl into my lap in the process. You are so. Stop putting your bony elbows on me. Hi. Yay. Right. Lex should be with us shortly, and then we're going to get into our sanctuary chat for today. Hi, Lex.
Hi.
How's it going?
It's going well. It's been a weird week. We found a cat last week and
Oh,
yeah, she's a sweetheart, but like adjusting to like a pet in your home when you haven't had pets in a really long time is an adjustment.
yeah,
So,
it is. And also, like, cats have very independent minds, whether you want them to or not.
yeah. No, I mean she's a sweetheart, but like we haven't really like set up a schedule yet. So it's like she'll come in and she'll like meow for food and I'm like can't feed you right now, pal. I'm working. Like,
She's like, but I'm hungry, so you should
yeah.
just say.
Yep.
Also, feral cats have this tendency of just like eating all the time and thinking that they need to eat all the time. And you're like, no, I'm trying to help you, buddy. Like,
Yeah, no, actually, she's incredibly thin, so we're letting her eat whenever,
fair enough.
like, we're available to feed her, but, and she's putting on weight, which is awesome, but yeah,
It'll just be
it's a lot.
like once she gets to a healthy weight, then you'll just have to deal with the like incessant meows for
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's exciting. Willow decided to wake me up at like 20 to 6 this morning, which was fun. So we've been very awake for a very long time, now hitting nap time levels apparently. Uh, yeah, that's your.
Yeah, she looks tired.
So we'll get into sanctuary chats, but why don't you tell us a bit about who you are and what you're doing these days?
Yeah, so I am a tarot reader and folk magical educator, and I help people get in tune with their intuition and access the tools and inner wisdom, their own inner wisdom, so that they can navigate their own spiritual journeys instead of relying on other people to mediate those journeys for them. So I want to equip people and empower them with the tools to explore the liminal. What else about me? My name is Lex. I use they them pronouns. Yeah, I think that's the relevant like 3 sentences about me and what I do.
Fantastic. I also like, I really appreciate, and we've had this conversation on the Cackle Podcast before, but I really appreciate the approach that you take of like doing ancestral and underworld magic, which can often be like quite rooted in religion and also in like very static stories, and like approaching it through a queer lens. Because, of course, like as queer folks, we're like, of course we do it through a queer lens. But it's, I think, like, I don't know if it's just that we're like more aware within the queer community of how many stories aren't written down and aren't told fully, and how stories that are written down are maybe like a portion of what is accurate. You know, when you're like reading stories of like so and so dressed in men's clothes and did this and da da da, and you're like, okay, cool. So here's our ancestors. Um, but then, like, can you move your head, please? But you know, like we're, I think, more aware of it generally, but it still doesn't make it necessarily easier to navigate, you know, what are those lost stories in your own lineage? How do you kind of do that ancestral work with people who may or may not be on records that you may or may not have access to? And it's honestly, I think for the vast majority of folks, that's the realities of what ancestor kind of study and spirit work is. But if you have like a she's very in the way today. If you have like written records, then there can be this, I don't know if it's like a just an assumption that that's the story, and we're sticking with that, and that also you need to accept that as being your own story as well,
Yeah.
and also that your own experience of leaving stories will come to those who are after the fact, rather than figuring out like what is my story that I am writing now and how can I be a good ancestor now.
Yeah. 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 And I think one of the reasons why like folk magic and ancestor work within the context of folk magic are so important to me is because like I'm interested in the things that are like common and widespread, and like every culture that I've read about. I mean, like I don't want to like make huge blank, but like damn near every culture has ancestor work practices, you know, and has some sort of magical practice of some sort, you know, like so why do we need to like totally reinvent the wheel
Mm-hmm.
with respect to like our magical practices when we could go back to what is established and then build from there?
Yes.
You know, like yeah, because like in so much of what you were describing with respect to like our ancestral stories, like our ancestral stories, those ones that are fixed on paper and those ones that are like told through like official channels,
Mm-hmm.
are like the stories of official channels, and they're stories of disconnection. Like how could these stories that are rooted in disconnection, because so many of them are about like property rights,
Yes. Yes.
um how
How
could
missing from the records just based on that. Like,
yeah. Yeah.
and
And so like when we have our records like rooted in property rights and our stories rooted in like the structure that comes from that, like how can we build something that's magical and fixes that? Like you need to go back, get a foundation, and then build from there.
yes,
Yeah.
totally. And it's also that thing of like, it's written from, I mean, like, we say it's written from the winner's point of view when we're talking about wars, but it's also like the people in power. So like, if there was like, I mean, I'm thinking of like interracial couples back, like let's say 200 years ago, like that, just like that thing of, especially where it's written from property rights. There are so many people that aren't even recorded that way, and then the number of communities around the world where it's oral traditions, and so there aren't written records for a very large portion. And then you look at wars where wars have happened around the world and there's massive gaps in records during those periods of time. And so if there's a period of stability after the fact, then there might be records that follow after the fact. But like there's so much inconsistency with written records. There's so much error and intentional error that can be in place there. And it also assumes that these are fixed things and that we should also be trusting what is written down, and that whatever is written down is what is important to know, right? Like I think
Yeah.
of your community, the way that we form families and the way that we choose families, and that would not be written down in records, right? And so it's like, okay, how many folks um, chose never to marry and but created family units with others and those aren't recorded down, or how many people married one person for, property reasons and then had like an entire family in a different space, and like that's not recorded down. And so if you're looking through your own family tree, you're seeing one portion, but you're like, I don't know if that's fully accurate. You also don't necessarily know about like if there were, I'm thinking of the time frame where, which depending on the community you're in might still be the language that's used, but like illegitimate children, like that being written down, and like there's so much that can be missing just at the like most basic levels of written records, and considering that as law. Uh, um, and so when you're going to do that ancestor work, like trying to fill in the gaps. And then also, if there are ancestors, which honestly, probably for most of us, definitely for white folks, ancestors who have like really fucked up histories, and like, do you take that on as your story? And if you don't want to take that on as your story, then how do you still acknowledge it and just in terms of like when I think of folk magic, I often think of the ancestral traumas that get passed down through generations, and how your ancestors will also like keep passing it down until somebody in the line is like, okay, I'm ready to deal with this so that I can go on and deal with my own shit. But like, you guys keep on bringing this up, so I guess we got to deal with it too.
Yeah. Yeah. I just so much about I have so many things to say, but like I think what you said about written record and like prioritizing written record just like kind of gave me like this like mind blown moment, because I'm in the process of like moving away from using slides in my workshops.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and facilitating educational experiences without slides.
Yes, which
And
like,
it's felt really important for me
yeah.
to do that and like to move towards like more of an oral tradition. I'm like, I don't quite understand why this is happening, but like it's clear for me that this is what needs to happen. And it's just like, oh, that's like you just articulated part of why we need to like it's deprioritizing the written word as the be all end all of factual information.
Yes. Well, and it's so interesting too because it's like also training slash educating your students and your audience that that's okay as well. Like, I just think of when I'm teaching, if I don't have a handout associated with the class, people often, and I'm totally like this too. I love a good handout. I love, a quick key, like cheat sheet of vocabulary or something. And I think of the number of times where I'm teaching, and if I don't have a handout, then that like reflects on the experience that the students are having. And it can actually result in people being like, well, I didn't feel like I got anything out of this class. And it's like, okay, but if I gave you a cheat sheet of the vocabulary that we went over, that you could have taken your own notes about based on your own interpretations of it, then that would have felt like a class to you. And it's this very interesting, but very also like makes sense in terms of the way that we prioritize Western education models, and like this very like lecture, like expert standing at the front of the room, and everybody else like of whatever the subject matter is, rather than it being a dialogue.
Yeah, and it's sort of like I don't know. I'm because I used to be a teacher and like navigating the space because like I know that the people I'm teaching like have for the most part grown up and learned in those systems, and so like I always do handouts. I love them. I love putting them together. Like it's clarifying for me. So like yeah, so like I do handouts, but it's like I'm also not gonna give you slides. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I'm like I will give you like the highlights or like a resource list so that you can continue doing your own research.
Mm-hmm.
But like you, it's almost like yeah, it's like a gentle reorientation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or then when you get, I find this often in webinar situations where it's like, people are using it as a tool for whatever, and they want to make sure that people are like actually being engaged in the workshop in theory. But it's like, it'll be a fill in the blank where it's like this plus this equals this, and the this and this and this get talked about in the workshop. I'm like, why don't you just give people it? I understand the idea behind it, which is that you want people to actually attend the live workshop. That's the purpose of doing the webinar, and you want them to be paying attention, and so you're going to give like kind of a hook in the handout so that they pay attention. But as somebody who likes to be present during workshops, and also has a dog who likes to interrupt me fairly regularly, like if I miss that point, like I'm not generally looking through my notes while I'm attending a lecture. And
Yeah.
so after the fact, when I go to like fill it in and like be taking down my own notes, I'm like, oh fuck, I missed something important. But like clearly it didn't feel that important to my brain to have attached those things and to have maintained that knowledge in a conscious sense.
Yeah, like that's it's also like not in like my ideal educational settings. Like it's not a requirement that like the perspective of the teacher be the perspective that the student
Yeah.
takes on.
Yeah.
And so like yeah, like that kind of thing is like there's one right way to think about this and it's the teacher's way. And it's
Yeah.
like
Don't,
no, like there's so many different perspectives.
yeah, totally, totally. So as far as the way that this then kind of applies to your ancestral work and your facilitation, like your workshop facilitations these days, how have you kind of like been noticing that maybe shifting, or does it feel like it's maybe being like kind of guided by something?
Yeah, I sort of play with like different formats for different like settings. Like I facilitate I teaching's like my it's what I do in
Yeah.
a lot of ways. And so there's a couple I have different ways that I like format different information. So like sometimes when I'm running a workshop, it is a more experiential workshop. And so while I'm presenting information, like also participation and information from like the students or like participants, right, is an essential part of my planning. You
Yes.
know, like opening up space within the lecture portion for people to provide their own experience and their own thoughts. Like that can be super important, especially when whatever I'm teaching ends in like a guided journey.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because like usually when I'm facilitating journey work, spirit work through the internet, like I'm restricting it to like your own inner realms.
Right.
And
Yes.
so that kind of like cues people like, let's start talking about your inner realms. Let's start talking about your experiences of like queer magic or like whatever I'm teaching about, you know? But then last week I ran a workshop on honoring our queer ancestors, which was basically just like, this is like the quick and dirty like masterclass. Like in 90 minutes, I'm going to give you everything I know about working with queer ancestors. Um, and that was not like there was a question answer period at the end, but like I was just me talking for like 75 minutes.
Yeah.
And then like what I'm finding works there is like, you know, I have somebody monitoring the chat
Mhm.
so that they can collect questions or like things where there was like, confusion. So like it can there's that portion where like a real time like thinking space or like interaction space
Yeah.
that's not necessarily like unmute and feel free to share your responses, you know? And so like figuring out, yeah, how to facilitate and like make space for participation
Yeah.
is, yeah. It's, and especially within like, you know, the online Zoom
Yeah.
is, it's its own thing.
It, there's also like, I mean, we experience it while we do these of like, oh, there's a lag time, or like, oh, somebody said something, but like, maybe, you know, like, whereas when you're in a real life setting as opposed to a digital setting, then, or a virtual setting, the energy of the room can also be felt a little bit easier. You can kind of like tell when silence is that people are really digesting something versus when like there's just, okay, that did not sync. Let me go back over that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. And I think like just personally, like my goal when I'm teaching is always to end with questions is for the people participating to have questions
yeah,
because there are like two ways you don't end up with questions is like they're just so confused they have no idea like what even to ask, or two, like you've told them like they've taken what you've said and it's like this is the one way, there's no possible other interpretations. Like no, there needs that. If I end a lecture or a class or a workshop or like whatever I'm teaching and there's no questions at the end, like I have done a bad job.
It's, yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that I'm finding really interesting as I continue like living in online space and facilitating online spaces is sharing resources with folks, like with the Sanctuary Hub. I mean, it's like it's full of very specific resources, but it's also an extension of the Creative Coven community generally, which is that like I get asked similar questions about similar topics all the fucking time. And I'm very happy to like, if I'm really getting into something with someone about a specific topic, being able to just like copy and paste a list. I mean, that's essentially what From Field to Skin is as well. It's just like, here's a bunch of shit, go down whatever rabbit hole you want to go down. But also to honor my own time in that I have gone and I've found these resources and I'm studying them myself. And I'm like, as I'm constantly adding to them as well, like to honor all of that work, then it's like, okay, if you want access to these things and you want access to them whenever you want access to them, then join the community and then you can go down whatever rabbit hole. But I think like for me, it's become a really important part of it is as I get interested in a topic, I'm like, okay, let me add an extra bookshelf over here. These
Yeah. Yeah, and I love the way you're like pairing that idea with like the idea of sanctuary is like, because I was thinking about this because I like, you're like the first question I'm going to ask, and we haven't talked about this question yet, so it's kind of hilarious, but is like, what is sanctuary? And I was like thinking about it today, and I'm like, okay, there's this idea of sanctuary as like a place where worship happens, but like it's from my perspective, it's like so much more than that. Is it's like it is a fixed space in the physical,
mm-hmm.
wherein like the liminal, the divine can become manifest.
Ooh, like this.
Yeah, and so like there's this function of sanctuary as our homes, where like our homes are this space that in by nature of being stable allows us to grow and develop and transform. And
Mm-hmm.
like church sanctuaries, are, and like any kind of like a temple, right? Or like, an ancient temple even, like these are sacred spaces that are monuments. They are fixed. They have like prominent physical manifestation, um, but wherein the divine comes and we can experience gnosis, we can experience the spirit of God, like whatever you experience in your like religious sanctuary spaces, like it allows that space, like by nature of its physicality and by nature of the work that goes in to maintain a sanctuary,
Mm-hmm.
um, it opens up portals to new worlds, which is like what you do by like facilitating resources for the acquisition of knowledge.
Yeah. I also really love the idea of portals and a sanctuary being a portal to this like new liminal space that you have been. Can you move your face, please? You're very uh where it's like oh yeah, it's so bony. God. Uh yeah, portal it made my brain go like, oh yes, because it is this like it makes me literally think of like a cave where you like walk down into a cave, which is often actually where like ancient sanctuaries had been, was in these cave spaces, and where there's like anytime I've entered a cave, it immediately feels like a sacred space, and
Mm-hmm.
it can be like very very actively used or can be very much abandoned by most creatures at this point, but there's always something sacred and like otherworldly about caves, I find, and where
Mm-hmm.
is definitely like more planes at play than just, and like it's not always a comfortable space. Like sometimes you walk into a cave and you're like, oh shit, I should not be here right now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it definitely like depends on the facility, like the spirits that are facilitating that space, right? Like I was definitely thinking more about like human created sanctuaries, but like, yeah, it doesn't. There are definitely like precedents in like various cultures and traditions of like, you know, sacred spaces that are like sacred without the intervention of like human care, you
Yeah.
know? And yeah, they're two very different kinds of sanctuaries. And some say, yeah, and it's interesting, like we tend to think of sanctuary as like a safe space,
Mm-hmm.
but anytime like transformation is happening, there's always risk.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah, the idea of a sanctuary being like a beginning safe space that then opens up potential, which also makes me thinking of like Portal. This is also just, I watch clearly way too many fantasy shows, too many fantasy books, but like, you know, where it's like you enter into a space that is supposed to be a sanctuary or was created as a sanctuary, and then something fucked up happened, or something that is like way more powerful than what humans thought they were calling in on comes.
Mm-hmm.
That's that's something really interesting about like how sanctuary can become corrupted in some space, in some aspects, but then also just like it goes beyond the control or the expectation of what you're thinking, which also makes me think about, you know, what does the role of sanctuary play when we don't have secure housing, or when your home is not safe for whatever period of time. Like it might be
Mm-hmm.
like the space itself is insecure in that, you know, you might be risking like rent increasing or foreclosure on a mortgage or something, but it could also be that like there's a period of time where somebody moves into your home and it doesn't feel safe, or where you are not taking care of your like body vessel, and so your house becomes not safe during that period of time. And then like how do we rebuild these spaces and kind of replenish them? It's, which also then my brain goes over to the ancestor work, and I'm like, same with ghosts, right? Like if a ghost has unfinished business and something is, you know, it's like it's settled, how can we help it to settle? How can we help it to feel uh comfortable again, so that I, you know, even if it's just like big old ghosty energy that's just like generally not settled and also not subtle, like if we're going to be cohabitating, how do we help it to feel settled enough that it's not disturbing us all the time?
Yeah. Yeah. So many thoughts. Where do I want to start? um, yeah, I think like, okay, thinking about like a couple of things is like this concept of like home as sanctuary, you know, it's like and what, and like that's, I think I just want to clarify, like that's like one of like the most obvious, easiest, but
Yes.
it's not a requirement, you
Yeah.
know, like there are so many ways to build sanctuaries that look nothing like our lived experiences of stability, safety, and security.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that doesn't, like, one is not better than the other, and like your
Yes.
home is not a better sanctuary than like something else that you create.
Yeah.
Um, but I've also kind of like, I'm thinking about also like trans embodiments as sacred,
Mm-hmm.
and like, okay, yeah, so like you're like letting your body become a transitional expression of yourself, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like that in and of itself is sacred, and like allowing yourself to become liminal is a
Yes.
sacred process.
Yes.
And I think in like the bigger picture, like of sanctuary, right, like neither of these conditions of personal sanctuary are sufficient, and like personal sacredness are sufficient conditions for like kind of like collective and like larger.
Yeah.
Which of course like does also bring us back to the ancestor work portion that you were bringing in, and it's like ancestor work is meant to be collective work.
Mm-hmm.
And while we now approach it individually because we live in an individualist culture and because we've been separated from larger historical, cultural, collective traditions, that doesn't change the fact that this isn't really work that functions on an individual level, you know? So like there's that personal level of like, I have an ancestor who is bothering me. I need to deal with, you know, whatever restlessness their ghost has. But ultimately, that is just that isn't the whole of ancestor. The whole of ancestor work is like actually like this collective process wherein we're all doing this work, and so there's like way less ghosts because your ancestors have been like properly facilitated into the afterlife, or they never experienced like that disconnection from spirit, and they don't have to be reconnected to it. Yeah, and so it like functions on multiple levels. Like the sanctuary of your home, you can make your home a beautiful, sacred sanctuary. But if your community outside is not well resourced, if you are atomized in your home and you're not connected to your community outside of your door, if you are a trans person who lives in an area that is largely hostile and unsafe to you, these are all ways that personal individual sanctuary falls short of a like larger collective transcendent experience of like,
Yes.
yeah, the sacred.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I appreciate that very clear like example. It also has me thinking of like trans embodiment as sacred, also then leading to how like sanctuary, even if it is made physical, does not need to be static. And in fact, it should not be static if it is truly sanctuary. Like it is a living entity, even if it is made physical. And part of living entities being allowed to stay healthy is allowing them to stay in flux.
Yeah, yeah. And I think like that's like, you know, in a world that's obsessed with like passing and where like access to trans care is often predicated on a desire to pass.
Yes.
Um,
Desire to pass as the opposite of whatever, like we're
yes.
binaries, and the passing is that you are going from one end of the binary to the other. And
Yep.
if you stay closer to your side of what has currently been determined as being your side of the binary, then you are not performing transness in the right way.
Yeah, yeah. And it's like, I think we can, if we're thinking about transness as sacred and that expression as creating sanctuary, then like it's really, really obvious that passing should not be the bar upon which that becomes sacred, is because like when you collaborate with the spiritual, like any spirit, like that takes work
Yes.
to maintain, and the way that work looks over time will change. Like sometimes working with that spirit, whatever spirit you're using to create sanctuary with, like it's going to look like daily work or weekly work, or sometimes it's just whenever work.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a candle, sometimes it's a prayer. Like it always is changing, and that's just part of it.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, I think when we get too rigid and things, which also just like across the board, rigidity is usually when we start to fuck up, right? It's like there's either like we need that bend, and even when we look at the natural world, like trees are obvious examples that we often use, where a tree bending is given as a good example rather than when it breaks. But rocks are similar. Like even these things that we think as being as very static and being um, very like they have one form and they stay in that form. I mean, it makes me think of, my family on the East Coast where we have the highest tides in the world. Erosion is like at a very extreme and very fast example that is constantly in front of you, that is faster than in other places. And so we get to see, through this process of erosion, like a stone that is put in front of you, and that stone is millions of years old. And it has not always looked like that, but it has always had some form. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't have a short lifespan, it has a very long lifespan, but that lifespan involves change. And it's a thing that's like, I think, really hard for humans, just generally to accept. I definitely have a hard time with it. But it's also the one thing that we can guarantee in life is that there will be change, and the longer that we live, there will be more change. And that should be seen as a good thing because it's giving us more experiences, right? Like we don't want to have, or generally, we don't want to have a short lifespan that does not have much change because we've stayed in a very safe little bubble, and also we leave this world at a too early time.
Yeah. Yeah. And like even bringing it back to like rocks and like rocks change, like that's the basis of the phosphorus cycle is that rocks are eroded and release phosphorus,
Mhm.
which is essential for like everything on the earth to live.
Yep.
So if rocks were totally stagnant and didn't change and didn't, erode, then we wouldn't have anything alive.
Mhm. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thing is like it's all in balance, and whether we understand it or not doesn't change the fact that it's still required for balance. Like, and which gets me back thinking to ancestor work and how like there's stuff that we won't ever understand, and there's stuff that we're never going to get clear answers on, and that can be incredibly frustrating, especially when it's fresh enough ancestors that you're like, I wish that I knew, like especially if they were alive, like if your lifetimes overlapped with one another, and now they're no longer overlapping, and you're like, oh, I wish I knew this answer to this thing. That's like you can wish that you had the answer, and it doesn't change the fact that you're never going to know everything. Like
Mm-hmm.
we can write journals, we can leave. I mean, I'm thinking right now of like the size of the digital imprints that we are leaving
Yeah.
for our descendants at this point, assuming that they still have the technology that allows them to watch or read this stuff. We're leaving larger imprints than ever before, and that's still not going to give a complete visual of what our lives were. And that's kind of the point, because it's, each of us also needs to be living our own lives and not be fully focused on somebody else's life experience. But it can be frustrating when you're like, I just want to know. Like, I wish I knew.
Yeah. 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 I think about that a lot actually. Like I keep a like paper journal of like all of the tasks that I have to do in a day. And like that's just like for my ADHD. And it's just like all of the, and I know like all of the things that don't make it in there,
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, and all the stuff like that. I mean, the amount of things that I write down into my books, and then I still end up having sticky notes that end up in the recycling, right? Like, it's like, okay, this is actually like too much detail, and it's going to overwhelm me in this one form. So I'm going to put it over here. And like, if we were to just look at, what are we leaving as our digital archive, it's curated. Like I don't put everything out there. And even if somebody were to go through my personal computers and find every single thing that I've got, that like definitely there's plenty of stuff in there that nobody else needs to see. But even if somebody did go and find it, it's still only a snapshot. And it's that, yeah, that is kind of the point. Like I think of like when when you're a kid and people like ask you what superpower do you wish that you would have, I would always say flight, but often people will say mind reading, and I'm like, I would hate that. Like I don't want that many people's thoughts in my head, but also like there's thoughts that we should be able to keep private to ourselves, and all, and like especially when you're like unlearning something, like that thought is going to come first, and then the whole point of learning and unlearning is that you then recognize it and start to pick it apart and recognize like where it is flawed and faulty and wrong in some cases. But yeah, there's just like shit that we don't need to know, and that creates much larger problems than are necessary by being aware of, oh, that one thought came into this person's head. Like we actually don't need
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. And that actually makes me think of like like moments, like the kinds of moments you can't record, like, you know, like when you're sitting on the porch petting your cat and it's raining and it's just like perfect, you
Yeah.
know, like the and now I'm like those moments are like sanctuaries, and it's just like we're getting like sanctuary fractals.
Mhm.
But like, yeah, those moments are just like you can't record them, you can't save them, they can't be written into the record,
Mhm.
and like that's important actually. And like and if even if you know if somebody were to have access to all of that information, I would be willing to bet that it was those kinds of moments that like that access would preclude, you
Yeah.
know, that would get lost in seeking that like all-encompassing vision.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it would also still be seen through somebody else's lens and experience, right? Like I'm regularly reminded that the way that my brain works, other people's brains don't work that way.
Yeah.
Uh, but I'm always fascinated by it. And same with like colors, the way that people see colors so different. And as an artist, as a natural dyer, I am very often thinking to myself, oh, I wish I could see through your eyeballs right now to see what colors you are seeing.
Mm-hmm.
It also then when we're thinking about like hearing somebody's story, we are then always putting it then through our hands. And when we're in an unbalanced state, then that can mean that we are very, reactionary or making assumptions about it. It can become very toxic.
Yeah.
But even if we are in a really balanced state and we are just like, soaking in what somebody else is telling us and it's not triggering us in any sort of a way, we still don't know the full, life story picture that then that person is seeing a thing through. It makes it like really simple examples of it is when, if somebody has been modeled behavior within their family units all through life, and then you're in relationship together and you've been modeled a very different thing, and then you're having not necessarily even conflict, just like recognizing, oh, we don't see this through the same lens,
Mm-hmm.
and and then figuring out, okay, how do we kind of navigate that? But until you're aware that you're looking at it through a very different lens, then you're not even thinking, because for you it's like, oh, this is just like, this is normal, right? And
Yeah.
it can become very apparent when there's conflict at play, but it can also be in those like very basic moments where there's no conflict. It's just like, oh, we're looking at this differently. And a lot of times it's not like a right or wrong or like a healthy, not healthy, anything like that. It's just different.
Yeah. 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 I think about this a lot in a spiritual context, actually, because I do these sessions, I call them true story transformations. And the whole idea behind them is that, like, it doesn't, whatever story you're telling yourself probably isn't true. And whatever story you want to replace it with it also doesn't have to be true.
Yes.
Right. So, like, the idea is like, me and my client, we come together and we look at like this story that's like keeping them stuck,
Mm-hmm.
and like what is this story, um and how do we retell it, what story can we replace it with. And it doesn't matter, like the first story is not true, right? So like we poke holes in that first story and then we write a totally new story. Like what's your best story coming out of this? Like how do you what's the most ridiculous, like shiny, sexy, fun story that you could have at the end of this, like the one that your brain just like doesn't want to even contemplate. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the story you're going to leave with after this, and we're going to strategize how to make it happen.
Yeah.
Because like your perspective isn't true necessarily, right? Like you can have that correct perspective, like the true one, and you could have it,
Yeah.
But like probably you're like it's being mediated through like your emotions and how you grew up and the society you live in and all of these like confluence of factors that are like causing reactions and like fears that might deviate from like your core soul inner truth, you know. It doesn't even matter if like that core soul inner truth exists. Like I'm agnostic to that, right? Like if you have an idea that that's what you're accessing, like cool. If you do not think it exists, like cool, it doesn't matter. Like the truth is totally relative in
Yeah.
this, and like the only thing that matters is that like we're gonna get you moving in a way that makes you feel inspired and excited and moving towards like what you actually want instead of like stumbling over the accumulated perspectives and stories and like ideas of people that are not you.
Yes. It totally reminds me of like in EMDR sessions when there's a particularly disturbing memory
Mm-hmm.
and intentionally going in and changing the memory and
Mm-hmm.
brain so that then it makes it less disturbing so that you don't keep on tripping over it. And it also gets me thinking of like the way that the word gaslight has been so coded and like gets missed so frequently within our society right now. And like the number of times where it's actually true gaslighting is honestly a fraction of the number of times that people actually use the word. Often it's that you had an experience, the other person had a different experience, you were triggered within the experience, and you don't want to acknowledge that somebody else's experience is different than yours. And so therefore they are gaslighting you. But that's not actually what gaslighting truly is. And when we are using that word, like I mean, for me, I have a really hard time and I have to like remind myself to kind of back down in moments because whenever somebody uses the word, I immediately go to like, is that true though? Like, what are you actually making space for the other person's experience right here?
Mm-hmm.
Reality is relative. Reality is also like, there's so many ways that we can be looking at it, but your reality and somebody else's reality don't need to match, and you can have had the same experience, and that's a third reality. And so within all of those, if something was problematic, then like unless there was true, like malice involved, then most of the time there wasn't gaslighting at play. It's just that you had a disagreement, you came away feeling shitty. And so now we come together and try to figure out like, how do we make amends for that? What amount of responsibility kind of lies with each party? And how do we move forward? And do we move forward together? Potentially we don't, but how do we move forward and not get stuck in that one experience and allow that to then shape everything else moving forward? And also where then especially if like one party gets especially stuck in it, it's like, okay, that's like it does get to a point where it is a choice. Like
Mm-hmm.
moment with choice and the like, if PTSD is involved, like there's absolutely nuance and complications to it, but it does come to a point where regardless of what trauma and mental health factors are on top of the initial experience, there's only so much that other people can help you, and you do have to take responsibility to some extent of how do you get yourself, even if you can't get yourself to like fully moving past it, how do you get yourself to a point where you are able to open up enough to accept other people's assistance in then helping you move past it?
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. And like on one level, like as with people like calling a lot of things that aren't gaslighting, like can you blame them because they're feeling gaslit about, by the whole world, like, you know? And it's just
Like the
like you're correctly describing what you're experiencing, but you're like putting it on the wrong thing, you
yes.
know? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Like I think especially when we're in marginalized communities and we're burnt out, like absolutely your capacity to put up with one more moment of bullshit is going to be so much less. And that's such like like a reasonable experience. But I think like you're totally right. The like we're being gaslit by society and systems of oppression on the fucking daily. Individuals, like I think that's where it starts to get like complicated, right? Where it's like, okay, these systems of oppression are absolutely gaslighting us and telling us that, oh, you should feel fine, you should, ignore this thing that is like highly fucked up and clearly causing problems. When we bring it down to the individual level, it's like, okay, did that individual mean this with malice in order to keep you in place? And in the moments where you're like fucking exhausted, then it's also very reasonable, well, not necessarily reasonable, but it is understandable when your response at the individual level is to be upset and lash out because you can't deal with the systemic. And so here's a tangible example in this moment of this person has hurt me. And so all of this frustration is now going to come out on that person.
Yeah.
And, I think we've seen, especially as everyone's been going through so much collective grief over the last few years with the pandemic, never mind all the other things, and how those of us who've like been dealing with mental health issues pre-pandemic and like actively dealing with them have like fared a little bit better because we had tools. And then all of a sudden everybody was like, oh shit, the world is fucked up. And we're like, yes, we've been telling you this for an extended period of time. But seeing then how on this like very wide scale, now everybody is in this dysregulated fashion to the state where like, you call a support desk and the automated message before you ever speak to a person is, please be polite to our people. It's like, okay, that's like, this is actually not okay that our society has gotten to this stage where everyone is so dysregulated that like we're all at this like reactionary place. And I think this is also where I like, with sanctuary and with this idea of prioritizing self-care, it's like self-care in order to then also be of service to your community. It's self-care in order to feed into community care.
Yeah.
I mean, we see it a lot in the community, but also in a lot of marginalized communities. It's this idea of to consider the idea of thriving is to abandon everybody else because we can't even we're barely surviving. And so to dare to consider the idea of thriving and to reach towards it is to be leaving everybody else behind. And we don't want to do that because we love them. And so we'll never get to thriving. And anybody who else thinks of thriving, we're going to shame them in order for us to all stay stuck in the bottom. And it's so unhealthy, and it may be like an understandable response to things, but it doesn't actually serve any of us.
Yeah. It makes me think, like, again, I was talking about like ancestor work is collective, but we approach it as the individual. And when we're thinking about like creating magical practices, like going back to what is universal, what is common, what is like everywhere, provides us a good foundation to build forward, because like we need new foundations for things, and like just we need, where was I going with that thought? We need new foundations for things. And and so like there's this collective problems are not solved on the individual level, but individuals need to rise to that the calling of the collective, right? Like to respond to collective issues. That still happens at the individual level, right? And it's sort of like, like when you're doing like group ritual or something, right? Like you need everybody to come along for the process. And it becomes more powerful because everyone comes along for the process. And I think, there's this relates to the spiritual, in my view, in a way that like I'm still kind of like rock tumbling this idea. But so I've been reading about this idea of elite capture of ideas, and there's a lovely essay, and I forget the author's name right now, Um,
I
but Patty is her first name. I can't remember the last name, but this lovely article about elite capture with Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Mhm.
and how Maslow's hierarchy of needs originally came from uh, the Blackfoot tribe. Maslow visited their reservation like shortly before he developed this idea, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs actually inverts the process that read about it, it's
Oh
amazing.
my God, my
It, yeah, and so we have this idea of like self-actualization, spiritual needs, expression of our personal gifts as being something that happens after we get our all of these other things met.
yes.
So it's superfluous in that view. It is extra. It is a bonus, right? And we're kind of like sold the idea of trading our gifts, our self-actualization, our desires for whatever it is that is required to access food and shelter and whatever, right? And then once we get to that level of accessing food and shelter, and like I don't know what the level, all the levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs before self-actualization.
Yeah.
Then once we get to the level of self-actualization, because we have this like sort of like inverted capitalist, like colonialist version through Maslow, once we get to self-actualization, everyone's like, oh no, 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 you cannot, that's a luxury. There
Yeah.
are people who are struggling. You can't have this. Instead of flipping it on its head and then our needs get met, we create community, we create continuity of community and like longevity of community through our own personal self-actualization in community, which is what the Blackfoot notion is.
This
And
makes
it's
more fucking sense.
right? And it's just like we have this like collective individual like gap and this gap of understanding because we have this kind of like capitalist notion of like how people get their needs met.
Right.
That and it's like it is in as of itself like a notion of self-actualization and expression of our individual gifts that like directly feeds and aids and abets capitalism.
Oh my God. It totally makes sense. So, because it's also like, I mean, we know that like mutual aid and mutual care and community care is what allows all of us to thrive. And in moments of like absolute chaos, that's, I mean, the ones who survive are the ones who root into that. When we isolate ourselves, it might just situations, but it doesn't actually, like, if that is the way that we move through our whole experience, it usually ends up you get picked up by the tiger. The tiger will eat you. Like there's or the bear will eat you or whatever. Like we do have to be in community. And we know that. Like we also, even if we're not consciously aware of it, we become supremely aware of it when our experience in community is threatened, right? Like it's why people have such a physically visceral fear attached to the idea of being canceled, and why also in a lot of like traditions around the world, when somebody is like, I'm thinking specifically of like in indigenous communities here, then like when there's problems within the community and somebody is acting in a way that is against the community and causing harm in the community, the very last option is to cast them out. And there are so many steps made prior to that to try to bring them back into the community, to try to support them and help them. And it is at the very last option when it's that, okay, we have tried everything, none of it is working, and you are putting that community at risk truly, that we are now choosing to exile you. And because it's like it's, I mean, back in the day, but also now it's the equivalent of a death sentence. And whether it's a physical death or like an emotional death or whatever, like to be cast out is like so dangerous. And I think also why people become like even just the possible threat of it makes people's hackles go up, and their response is to get like very defensive and vicious because there's so much fear attached to, but what if I lose my community? Um, and yeah, just like all of it is not, it's not helpful when that is the way that we are constantly dealing with situations, right? Is we're going to become reactive. We're not going to deal with something in advance. We're not going to, you know, make sure that when we have a conversation with somebody, you know, if we're frustrated with our significant other, that we make sure that we've had a good sleep and we've had a bunch of water to drink and we've had some nourishing food, and then we tackle the big conversation. It's, I'm mad at you, you've just come home, it's 10 o'clock at night, I haven't eaten, the last thing I ate was sugary, I haven't had any water recently, I'm tired, and now let's get into it. Like that's, you know, that they're like, I personally have a rule of like no serious conversations after 10 p.m., which I don't like have fixed as a rigid thing, but for a chunk of time it was rigid because I was in a situation where I did have to put that rule in place.
Mm-hmm.
But it like if we all made a point of being resourced, and there's obviously limitations to that in a lot of ways, but like making sure that you have water, making sure that you've slept, making sure that you've had something nourishing. And even if you're not always able to eat nourishing food, that, you know, you make sure that you have the protein and the sugar and the fat that you need for your body to function. Like that is going to create a stronger baseline for you automatically, even if everything else is completely out of control.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, yeah, and I mean, not to bring this back to transness again, but why not? But
Please.
like, but yeah, like not only like that, like making sure like your bodily needs are taken care of, but like not needing to like subjugate
Yeah.
yourself
Yes.
in order to do that. Like before I can access these things, I need to look this way or be this way. And like, you know, well, there are like, it is true, there are very real boundaries to accessing some of those things, like to the extent that you can without suppressing your truth, to, you know, maybe it's even creating little private personal sanctuaries where you don't have to suppress that, right?
Yeah.
And like it can look so many different ways, but like prioritizing your individual wholeness lets
Mm-hmm.
you show up in your wholeness to your community. And
Mm-hmm.
like that includes things like making sure you've eaten, but also that like you're able to express yourself and be in your gifts and your strengths. And
Yeah.
like I think that's, you know, I don't know if you follow the like tarot cards of the year.
Uh,
Um
this year is the Lover's Year.
yeah, yeah. And so this year when I was doing a lot of my year ahead readings, one of the messages that like kept coming up for people was go get involved in your community. Your community needs you. But
Mm-hmm.
what you need to do first is get clear on what your skills are, what your interests are, what you are bringing to community, what
Yeah.
you're interested, how you are interested in serving your community.
Yes.
Because your community, you know, if you just show up to a community organization, they will probably have things for you to do.
Yeah. Busy work.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't mean that that doesn't need to get done or that you can't do it because just because it's like not your zone of genius or like whatever. But like, if you show up to your community and you say, I have these skills, I would like to provide these skills and help with these skills. Like, yeah, sure, maybe sometimes you're still like doing copying and like passing out, like, you know, sticking up flyers or something. But like, also, you're probably going to be like writing copy. It's not copy. I guess it's still copy. I don't know. Whatever. You're going to be writing things for them, or like, you know, helping organizing meetings.
The
Mm-hmm.
color coding the spreadsheet so that everybody stays organized because the other people hate making those fucking spreadsheets. Or yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah. And it's like so important. And it's also important because like a lot of the times our community organizations are still products of capitalism and our understandings of like, you know, just like the ways we present information so often in lectures, where we started our talk today, is still very much informed by capitalist like processes of education. Like, so are organizing and organization informed by capitalist ideas of hierarchy and how things get done. And it's like, if you start with, what do I want to do? And you approach the organization and saying like, this is me, here is how I can help. And like, I'm ready to help with whatever you need, but like, these are my like special skills that I would love to share with you. Yes. Like, you are coming forward as a much better helper. And like, you are also like, you're centering your joy and your experience. And like, even if it's still like, maybe the organization isn't like, it's more hierarchical than you'd like, or like, whatever, you know, you can still show up, and your presence there becomes its own sort of rebuke of that, you know?
And you're also not going to burn out as fast.
Yes. Wait, so you're a better helper to your community, bottom line, you know? So yeah, inverting, the whole thing about inverting that pyramid is just like, yes. And that was the, you know, and that was the message that so many people got with the Lover's Card this year, is like, you know, prioritize what you want to do and then approach communities. Like, know what your skills are and then approach that organization.
Yes. So smart. This has been super delightful, and I feel like we could go on a bajillion more tangents, but also I'm cognizant of time. Do you have any final thoughts on Sanctuary? And also, where can people find you? We like didn't dig into tarot much at all, except at the very end.
Yeah.
What services do you provide, and how can people engage with you?
Yeah, so people can follow me on Instagram. They can find me on my website, thelexritchie.com. I offer tarot readings. I offer various forms of folk magical education, everything from ancestor work to how to read tarot. What was I going to say next? Oh, sign up for my newsletter. Yes. Liminal Letters. Liminal Letters is my newsletter. It is a love letter to the liminal. It goes out every Friday. It's my favorite thing that I do for my business. And yeah, okay. The last thing was last thoughts on Sanctuary. Last thoughts on Sanctuary. Ooh, can you give me a second? I want to like read from a book.
Ooh, yes, please.
So this is Faggots and Their Friends Between Revolutions.
Love it.
And I pulled this came up the other day. I was doing the Stonewall Ancestor Elevation Rite, and this was one of the, like, I was doing like some book divination, you know, you like flip the page, and this is the one that came up the other day, and I think it speaks really nicely to cultivating sacred spaces. The faggots cultivate beauty and harmony and peace, since these are states that the men do not know about. The lucky faggots live in the most beautiful places and make love in the most beautiful places and dance in the most beautiful places. Since the men are blind to beauty, they do not know that the lucky faggots live in the most beautiful places. And the lucky faggots do not tell them. Instead, they ask the unlucky faggots to come and join them. So I don't know. I think it speaks beautifully to cultivating personal individual sanctuary and the ways that that creates larger collective sanctuaries.
Yes. And also the boundaries around sanctuaries for, you know, not everything needs to be for everyone. And it's, especially at this current state of affairs.
Yeah.
That was delightful. Thank you so much for this, Lex. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a lovely conversation.
Yay, yay. So folks, if you want to find Lex, you know where to find them at The Lex Ritchie and thelexritchie.com. Be sure to sign up for some workshops, and make sure you sign up for that liminal letter so that you can find out when more workshops are happening. And of course, the Sanctuary Hub is open. There is, in fact, a Sanctuary themed tarot spread waiting for you to pull for yourself. And we are also getting ready for the Creative Coven Challenge so that you can start playing with Sanctuary on your needles. We're going to be hopping onto Zoom next week on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for that. And there's oodles of other goodies and lots of resources in the Sanctuary Hub. So you can find that link in my bio, ashalbert.com/sanctuary. And we'll be back tomorrow with my good friend Amanda Crook, who is a plant witch and just a general delightful human. So thank you so much, Lex, for being here. And
Yeah, thank you.
we'll see everybody tomorrow. Bye.